In this episode of Defining Diabetes, Jenny Smith and I are going to define standard deviation. Defining Diabetes is made possible by Dexcom, Omnipod, and Dancing for Diabetes. Please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise, and to always consult a physician before becoming bold with insulin or making any changes to your medical plan. What is standard deviation?
Overall, it's the calculated amount of time of variance or deviation for a group of numbers as a whole. I mean, if you really want like the true definition of standard deviation.
It's a mathematical term, right?
It's statistics. It's a mathematical statistical term so that we can actually measure, quantify essentially the amount of dispersion in a set of values. And for an easy way to describe it with diabetes specifically, and if you're looking at your CGM reports, thankfully Clarity is wonderful. It's got standard deviation right next to your overall average or your average goes. Standard deviation, the lower the value, the less variance you have in low to high numbers. So if you have a standard deviation of 20, you should have glucose values that look like these little gentle rolling hills up and down. If you have a standard deviation of 73, you will have a lot of mass variance that looks like you are on a roller coaster at Six Flags.
Is this goal... Is standard deviation, when it comes to diabetes, attached to the goal numbers? So here's what I've kind of learned, and if I'm wrong, then I tricked myself, and I'm wondering. If I set my I don't know, low goal at 70 and my high goal at 120, but I frequently go up to 150, that makes my standard deviation look higher.
Correct, because your upper value is going up, even though it's going above your target.
Right.
You're still getting above it. Now, so it's giving more variance. You're starting at 70, you're going up to 150, you're coming back to 100, you're going back up to 150. Your standard deviation is going to be higher with the same target as if you stayed 70 to 120 and down to 100 and back up to 110 and back down to 70. Your standard deviation is going to be lower.
I knew it. Okay. So that means that if I'm a person who gives myself this really tight goal of being between 80 and 120 all the time, but my reality is I'm more between 70 and 140, my standard deviation could, at first glance, look bad.
It could.
But it technically wouldn't be, because I'm still only deviating between 70 and 140.
Right.
Okay. So that's just something, it's probably not going to come up for a lot of people, but that flummoxed me for a while. I was like, how am I keeping my daughter's blood sugar so stable and my deviation looks bad? It was because my goals, the numbers that the app was using to make the decisions were so tight that even a tiny bit above or below it made it look way out of whack.
Well, and it's also specific to those values. You know, even if you had your target set, 80 to 150, let's say, but if you had 80 to 150 and then all the way back down to 80 and back up to 150 and all the way down to 180, you may have a lot of time in range. You're still going to have a higher standard deviation because it looks like a roller from a lower value to a higher value to a lower value. So again, it's the dispersion of the data points, right? It's the variance between the lower number to the higher number. So even with that still 80 to 150 as a target, let's say she's going from 80 to 110, back down to 80, back up to 90. That looks like those gentle rolls, and the number or the value change isn't as great. So the standard deviation is going to be lower. And she's still going to have good amount of time in range there, but her standard deviation will be lower because there's not as much change between the low to high value.
And for your health, even if it's between 80 and 140, you do not want to be bouncing up and down, bouncing up and down.
Oh, you do not.
Okay.
Standard deviation is a huge one. You definitely don't want the bounce. You want more gentle rolls.
Okay. So if we have standard deviation down and we have time and range down, RA1C should reflect that.
Correct.
Gotcha. Defining Diabetes on the Juicebox Podcast is brought to you by Dexcom, Omnipod, and Dancing for Diabetes. There are links in the show notes and at juiceboxpodcast.com to all the wonderful sponsors. But if you want to find out more about getting a free, no-obligation demo of the Omnipod, you can go to myomnipod.com/juicebox. To get started on the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor, dexcom.com/juicebox. And to learn about the good that's being done at Dancing for Diabetes, go to dancing4diabetes.com. Thanks for checking out Defining Diabetes. Come back every Friday as Jenny and I break down a new word or phrase that is impacting your life with type 1 diabetes. Those of you on social media can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And of course, the podcast is available in every podcast player you can imagine and at juiceboxpodcast.com. Please consider sharing the show with a friend or even an enemy. I mean, if they have type 1 diabetes and you don't like them, they still deserve good blood sugars. Hey, one last thing I want to thank you. The podcast continues to grow exponentially in downloads and subscribers month after month. Right now, it's the middle of July, and the podcast already has more downloads in July of 2019 than it had just 3 months ago in the entire month of April. And let me tell you something. There were a lot of downloads in April. You are growing a community and teaching people how to be healthier.